Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we've got another ship comparison video. This time, we're going to compare Iowa-class battleships to Iowa-class battleships. We're going to talk about some of the differences that were planned for Illinois and Kentucky, and if they would have made those later ships better than the base 4 Iowas, or not. Before we get started, I would like to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Naval Institute Press. Naval Institute Press just released the 3rd edition of Friedman's U.S. Battleships Illustrated Design History, which is one of my favorite books. I now have 3 copies of it. I keep one in the office and one by my bed. And now I've got one that I keep in my bag that I carry around with me. And this is the Bible if you're interested in the design and development of American battleships, including much of the information we're going to talk about today relating to the unbuilt Illinois and Kentucky. Because this doesn't just have the information about the battleships that were built, it's got all of the design studies leading up to them. So North Carolina had a ton of different design studies, some of which she was launching aircraft off the bow and only had aft turrets. You can read all about that and the decision why they moved away from it in here. You can read all about the changes that the Navy wanted to make to the Iowa-class battleships with Illinois and Kentucky and the subsequent Montana-class, all right here. And we'll talk about that more at the end of the video. Also, we're going to be auctioning off a couple of these that I have signed on eBay. So check the link in the description below for where you can get a copy of one of my favorite books signed by me. The U.S. Navy originally planned to build 4 Iowa-class battleships, laying them down in 1940 for Iowa and New Jersey, and 1941 for Missouri and Wisconsin. They were then going to start with the Montana-class as BB-65. However, since the Montana-class designs weren't finalized, and there was already a war raging in Europe, they authorized 2 more Iowa-class battleships. These were not exactly the ship that the Navy wanted. The Navy was okay getting 4 fast battleships to match the 4 fast battleships Japan had in the Congo class, but there were a lot of drawbacks to the Iowas. They didn't have significantly more firepower than the ships that came before them, even though they were 10,000 tons heavier, and they had no additional armor protection than the ships before them. In fact, the armor on an Iowa is basically identical to that of a South Dakota. A couple minor changes, but nothing significant. One of the biggest problems was the Navy never tank tested warheads against the torpedo defense of South Dakota or Iowa-class battleships until the designs were already too far along to change. And when they did that, they found that they had huge issues. And that was against the size of warhead that US torpedoes were carrying. Japanese long-lance torpedoes were even better, and we didn't even know it yet. But we did know that it could defeat the torpedo defense of Iowa-class battleships. The problem is the armored belt internally mounted forms part of our torpedo defense, and it's too rigid. Impacts there could be transmitted into the holding bulkhead behind it, and this right here is our last line of defense. So if that is defeated, well then huge internal compartments like the engine rooms are also flooded. With the ships already under construction of the South Dakota and Iowa classes, there wasn't much that the Navy could do. So rather than using the 2 internal tanks as fuel tanks, they changed those to voids and used the 2 outside tanks as the fuel tanks. Those outside tanks had more volume, so it meant these ships could carry more fuel. It also meant there was more fuel acting as a buffer to dampen the explosion before it got to the inside holding bulkhead. Every time I mention using fuel as a buffer, people are like, oh my God, that's going to explode. Well, hits to these ships are below water. So as soon as the projectile comes through, or the torpedo, water's coming in after it. Also, the bunker C that these ships were designed to carry is very thick and it doesn't burn easily. In fact, you have to preheat it before you put it into the boilers, or else it's too thick to pump and will not light. You can put a lighter out by dunking it into bunker C fuel oil. So the Navy was not at all concerned with the fuel blowing up. It is a very effective barrier. And I talk about the fuel as being the liquid loading in the outside tanks. Many of these tanks were liquid loaded with salt water or boiler feed water or other fluids like that. So it's not that the fuel is guaranteed to take a hit. The designers of Iowa-class battleships were aware that they didn't want the forces being transmitted from one bulkhead to the next. American torpedo defense was the best in the world, in my opinion, even though it's subpar on the Iowa-class battleships. So you'll notice the framing here is offset. So here's the support to the backer for the armored belt. This is not on actual frames. And then here's the support for the internal holding bulkhead. So they're not attached to each other. They are completely offset. And it's designed that if there's an issue out here, this will all shear away. Like this is just welded to the deck. It'll shear away, won't cause any issues. And this one will be able to absorb the last of the impact. While that bulkhead is very brittle, this one is thinner and it's made out of high tensile steel. So it will bend, but not break. That was good. Illinois and Kentucky retained that feature. What is bad is that this bulkhead is angled on the other decks up to third deck, but here it becomes a straight wall. And that was probably done because it gives you more storage space in here and it puts the bulkheads out there in the magazines and radio rooms and whatnot as having a straight wall. But it meant that there was less equivalent thickness here. And because it is making an angle at this deck, that is a point of weakness. So Illinois and Kentucky were going to do away with that. That was their major change to the torpedo defense. It's going to stay at the same angle as the rest of the holding bulkhead below it. So that's the major change we know about. We know about this change because we've seen pictures of Kentucky under construction where you can see this. We do not have any blueprints for Illinois and Kentucky. So far as I know, nobody has seen any of their original blueprints to show just the magnitude of the changes that were going to be placed between the earlier ships and the later ones. So I'm telling you what we know. Both Friedman and Summerall, my other Naval Institute Press Bible for Iowa-class battleships, mention in basically the same terms these changes here and the switch from riveted construction to welded construction. I've talked about it many times in the past. The Iowa-class battleships are largely riveted because they don't trust the new welding technology. By the end of World War II, when Illinois and Kentucky were being built, this fear of welding being more brittle had been dissipated. We'd been using more and more welding in shipbuilding. We'd been getting better and better at it, and it was no longer as big of a concern. So both Friedman and Summerall say that Illinois and Kentucky were going to be completely welded. In theory, welding a ship saves 10% of the weight, which is some 5,000 tons on an Iowa-class battleship. Imagine the room for growth if you had 10% more weight for an Iowa-class battleship. You could add even more anti-aircraft guns. There's the deck space for them, or even more electronics. Friedman talks about some of the ideas for what they would do with that extra weight, and we'll talk about some of the ideas for Illinois and Kentucky had they been completed later on. However, builders' photos show that it's not a 100% change. If you look at this riveted seam here in bulkhead 4, and then you look at this picture we're going to put on the screen, it shows, I think it's Kentucky, it might be Illinois, under construction, and you can see this riveted gusset plate right there. So clearly they're still doing some riveting in the hulls of these ships. It's not a full switch to weld, but we don't know what the extent of the changes are. Even the Bible doesn't tell us what those changes are because we just don't have those blueprints. Another change that we're aware of, again from builders' photos, not from actual blueprints, is that the part where the upper belt meets the lower belt is not going to be joined by keyways in Illinois and Kentucky. Instead, they're just going to drill holes and insert pegs that the belt will sit in. This is a huge simplification. And it brings up an interesting point. Even though the Iowas are wartime construction, they are very much gold platers. They have a lot of really complex machining that needs to be done to the plates as they're installed. In fact, pieces like the framing are not able to be pre-manufactured because they have to be able to match whatever angles these plates are, and because they're riveted, they're all overlapping. We don't know if Illinois and Kentucky's plates would overlap because of the switch to welding. In theory, they could butt right up to each other, but if they're just going by the plans of the older ships, they would still continue to overlap for whatever reason. We don't know. We do know that they placed orders for prefabricated framing, and that just might be more stuff like the armored belt where you get those huge plates and then the shipyard has to machine them down and machine the keyways into them and make them all lock together and put all the right angles into them. Or it may indicate something more than that. We just don't know. There's so much we don't know. We do know that Kentucky was completed up to second deck and launched. Illinois was disposed of significantly sooner than that because she wasn't as far along in her construction. But we don't have any of the documentation of what all these changes were to Kentucky. So, we also don't know what changes would have been made above the main deck. And the Navy had a ton of different configurations in mind for Illinois and Kentucky. Early on, they drew plans for converting them to aircraft carriers as it became apparent what the switchover in technology was going to be. And it was decided, that they're just too big and expensive to swap over for that, and we are building enough Essex-class carriers and they'll be done in time, so it's not worth it. So they then look at, if they complete them as a battleship, what changes will be made. And we have a link down in the description below where we talk about the King Nimitz design, which was allegedly scratched out on a napkin when these two men had dinner together one day. But it modifies the superstructure and anti-aircraft battery layout of Iowa-class battleships. Now that is too big of a change to make on the completed ships, so in theory, those changes are for Illinois and Kentucky still under construction. During World War II, the Iowa-class battleships primarily rode shotgun with the aircraft carriers and provided them with heavy anti-aircraft defense. Next to the aircraft carrier Saratoga, I believe Iowa-class battleships had the most barrels of any ship in the fleet. And if you're purely talking about throw weight, the Iowas are definitely up there, if not number one. But you could add more. So early design proposals for Illinois and Kentucky included removing the 16-inch main guns, like removing the whole battleship function from these vessels and replacing them with quadruple 8-inch 55 caliber guns, but not like a traditional heavy cruiser's 8-inch guns. These would not be rifled, so they can just shotgun anti-aircraft rounds. Some of the designs have only 2 of these quadruple turrets and a wide variety of 5-inch guns. Some of these designs have as many as 4 quadruple 8-inch 55 caliber turrets for shotgunning anti-aircraft ammunition. And I imagine these would be automatic like Salem's 8-inch guns. Whatever the case, Illinois and Kentucky were going to have some amount of top weight left over. And so there are a number of plans early on again for replacing their anti-aircraft batteries with heavier designs. So I would not be surprised if the 40mm guns gave way to 3-inch guns, and I wouldn't be surprised if the 20mm guns are either all twin or quadruple power-driven Thunderbolt mounts. And I would expect these vessels to carry an even heavier battery than the earlier Iowas. Other changes later on involved converting Kentucky into a BBG, or guided missile battleship. And this would have been along the same lines as cruisers like Little Rock or Boston, where they took wartime designs, Cleveland or Baltimore class cruisers, and they basically removed the aft part of the battery and replaced them with Talos missile launchers and other missiles and guidance systems. And there's some really interesting designs associated with those various missile battleship concepts. And I think they're god-awful ugly. I absolutely hate the MAC. A MAC is a combined mast smokestack. The French pioneered it with some of their treaty battleships during the interwar years, and a lot of our post-war conversions or new-built ships involved MACs, and I think they're absolutely disgusting looking. If you look at the anti-aircraft battleship designs, you'll see that without the long range of the main battery guns, they basically just have cruiser superstructures on there. They don't need a tall spotting tower for seamless fall of shot of the 16-inch guns. However, many of the missile battleship designs return to this obscenely tall superstructure with these really high MACs, which are venting the exhaust gases away from the missiles. The Iowas had top weight problems, and making the superstructure several stories taller for these MACs is not going to help that. Sure, you might be saving 5,000 tons weight by switching to welding, and you're saving more weight by removing a gun turret and all the anti-aircraft stuff, but I'm not a fan at all. If you're interested in seeing more about these later Iowa-class battleship designs, let us know in the comment section down below. So, which do I think is better? I think if Illinois and Kentucky had been completed with welding and heavier anti-aircraft batteries, but still retaining their 16-inch guns, they would have been better warships. Had the Navy chosen to only retain 4 battleships, I suspect the older Iowa and New Jersey would have not been brought out of mothballs, and Illinois and Kentucky would have been during subsequent wars. The various anti-aircraft shotgun designs, I think, are worse. They're fine for a World War II design. That's what the Iowas were doing. You still had the older battleships for shore bombardment. But post-war, with jet aircraft, they're utterly useless. I think we would have completed them just in time to scrap them. I don't even think they would have been worth saving in mothball with that sort of antiquated shotgun anti-aircraft technology. Potentially, we would have spent all that money converting them to the anti-aircraft technology, and then, since we had them, converted them to missiles. The missile designs, I do think, are worth it. They're ugly as sin, but they probably would not have been decommissioned and mothballed in the interwar years because they were so modernized. And if we have a battleship that has both cruise missiles and a 16-inch battery, then I don't see any of the other Iowa-class battleships being reactivated. I just see them using Illinois and Kentucky, or whichever ones are completed, off Korea, Vietnam, and then through to the end of the age of battleships. Which of the various Iowa-class configurations mentioned in Friedman do you think are really important changes that should have been made? Which ones do you think weren't necessary? Let us know in the comments section down below. And do you think older Iowas like New Jersey would have ever been brought back if newer ones like Illinois and Kentucky were there? I'd love to hear from you in the comments section. We'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Naval Institute Press, who gave us several copies of these books to auction off for you guys. Again, there's a link in the description for some of these that are autographed. If you win the bid on eBay, shoot us an email with your name so that I can personalize the book for you. And I should also mention that all the profits from selling these books come back into the museum. So Naval Institute Press gave us these books for free. We're not splitting any of the profits with them. It all comes back to us. So they are fully supporting the channel, and they support museum ships worldwide, not just New Jersey. So they are one of our favorite sponsors here on the channel and one of our dear partners. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State and also from a number of other businesses like Naval Institute Press and private individuals like yourself. There's a link in the description to donate if you'd like to support our museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find our channel. Thanks for watching.